All right, everybody, get ready, because today we're going to really dig into this fascinating case. We're talking about a Japanese black cow, and, well, let's just say this one really had the vets stumped. And for all you animal health pros out there, you know we're about to get into some seriously cool, seriously interesting stuff with bovine zoonotic leukosis. We're taking a deep dive into this research here, and you know what's really wild about this case? It really makes you rethink what you thought you knew about lymphoma.
It really does, yeah. I mean, you think lymphoma, you think all those swollen lymph nodes, right? But this cow threw us a real curveball.
Totally. All right, so picture this. A 5-year-old Japanese black cow shows up, and she's got this knuckling, like in her left hind leg. And as time goes on, it's not just the one leg, it's both hind limbs, even her tail starts getting weak. Eventually, she just couldn't even stand up. It's a pretty clear example of how, what you see at first glance isn't always the whole story.
It's so true. And what's even more interesting is that the initial exam, well, it wasn't exactly what you'd expect. Clinically, no fever, no swelling in the hind limbs, and get this, her blood work, totally normal.
Wait, really? Yeah.
White blood cell count, her lymphocytes all within the normal range. No sign of that classic lymphocytosis you expect with lymphoma.
Wow. Okay, so that's already pretty weird.
Yeah.
But it gets even stranger, right?
Oh, yeah, it gets way more interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
So they tested her thymidine kinase activity, which, if you don't know, is a pretty solid marker for lymphoma, but guess what? Came back totally normal.
No way.
Yeah, it was wild. Now, there was a little bit of a bump in her lactate dehydrogenase, which, that can be a lymphoma marker too, but she also had high AST and CK.
Right, so that points more towards muscle damage from her having trouble standing.
Exactly, which makes sense in this case. And then, to add another layer to this whole puzzle, they tested her for bovine leukemia virus, BLV, since it's pretty much a given with lymphoma in cattle.
Right, BLV. Got to check for it.
Yeah, for sure. And they did actually find it in her blood. But get this, the proviral load was super low.
So hold on, we've got a cow, can't use her back legs, blood work is normal, and she's barely positive for BLV. What do they even do next with that?
Okay, so because of all the neurological stuff and nothing else really making sense, they started treating her with fursultimine and vitamin 83E. Thinking maybe there's a thiamine deficiency going on.
Makes sense. It's a pretty common treatment for those kinds of symptoms.
Exactly. But here's the thing. She just did not respond to it at all. In fact, she just kept getting worse.
Oh, man. So they are dealing with a real mystery here. Severe neurological signs, but none of the usual lymphoma red flags. What happened? Did they ever figure it out?
So sadly, her prognosis just wasn't good, and they had to make the tough call to euthanize her. But this is where it gets really, really interesting. Like, during the postmortem...
Okay, now I'm hooked. What did they find?
All right, so get this. No obvious lesions. Not in the chest, not in the abdomen. And remember how we were talking about the classic swollen lymph nodes?
The textbook lymphoma sign, right?
Yes, totally. They were nowhere to be found. So it was time to get a little more hands-on, They decided to do a CT focused on her lumbar vertebrae all the way down to her pelvis. Figured something had to be up with her spinal cord.
A post-mortem CT scan? That's not something you hear about every day.
Not super common, I know, but in this case, it was the key. And what they found, well, let's just say it was pretty remarkable. So the CT scan, it showed this soft tissue mass right there in the sacral spinal canal. And it was mostly concentrated around the left nerve roots, from the L6 vertebra all the way down to the sacral vertebrae. And here's the kicker, it was actually compressing the spinal cord.
So it sounds like they finally found what was causing that hind limb paralysis. But was it lymphoma or something else entirely?
Well, yeah, so get this right. A closer look showed that the spinal epidural and the perimedullary adipose tissue, basically from L4 down to those sacral vertebrae, it was all increased. So to get to the bottom of it, they took samples of the mass and the surrounding tissue and sent them off for histopathology.
Makes sense. Time to put those tissues under the microscope. What'd they find?
Oh, man. The histopathology is like a whole other story was unfolding. You know how we were talking about, not seeing those typical lymphoma signs?
Yeah, it's crazy how things can be hiding in plain sight like that.
I know, right? So under the microscope, you could see the tumor invading the epidural adipose tissue, even getting into the nerve roots a little. And the tumor cells themselves, plus the immunohistochemistry, they were positive for CD20, negative for CD3, which pretty much screams B-cell lymphoma.
B-cell lymphoma. So it was lymphoma the whole time.
Yeah.
just hiding in a really unusual spot. But what about the BLV test? The one from before?
Oh, man, that's the million-dollar question. And this is where that BLV connection comes back in big time. Remember how we said her blood showed a really low BLV proviral load?
Yeah, it was super low.
Well, when they tested the tumor tissue, the proviral load was way higher, significantly higher. And not only that, but they found monoclonal integration of DLV in the tumor tissue.
Now, for those of us who don't spend all day staring through microscopes, what does that mean, that monoclonal integration thing? What does it tell us?
Oh, yeah, good question. So monoclonal integration, it basically means that all those tumor cells, they all came from one single BLV-infected cell. Like, imagine tracing their family tree back to one ancestor. That's what this is.
Okay, so it's like a smoking gun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that finding, it basically confirms it's enzootic bovine leukosis, EBL lymphoma caused by BLV.
Okay, so the tumor was related to BLV, but why was this case so strange? No classic lymphoma signs.
That is what makes this case so fascinating. Usually, EBL, it shows up as multicentric lymphoma, meaning you see tumors in tons of lymph nodes throughout the body.
Right, that's what's so weird about this one.
Exactly. This cow had a solitary extradural spinal cord mass. Crazy rare presentation.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but the needle was disguised as hay. But it all makes sense now, right? The tumor's location, right there in the spinal canal, putting pressure on those sacral nerve roots, that explains everything. The hindlimb paresis, the weakness, the tail problems, it all lines up.
Absolutely. In this case, it just shows how important it is to keep an open mind with these cases, especially when things don't add up right away.
And it makes you wonder, how many cases of spinal lymphoma in large animals, cows, horses, are going undiagnosed? Because you can't just do a CT scan on every animal that shows up with some weakness in their back legs.
That's a really good point. This case really highlights the limitations we face sometimes when we're trying to diagnose these conditions.
I mean, this case, it's a total eye-opener. Shows you how important it is to think outside the box when you're diagnosing these cases. Especially when, it doesn't look like textbook lymphoma right off the bat.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We can't get stuck in those textbook presentations. This cow's a perfect example of that. Lymphoma can pop up in the craziest ways.
So, for all the veterinary pros out there listening, what's the big takeaway from all of this?
I think the biggest thing is you got to keep lymphoma on your radar, even when the classic signs aren't there. Like those swollen lymph nodes, weird blood work, especially when you're dealing with neurological problems like we saw with this cow.
It's a good reminder of those textbooks. They don't always capture the wild stuff we see in practice, do they?
Not even close. This case, it threw us all for a loop. And you know what else this case really highlights? The importance of postmortem imaging, especially in large animal.
That CT scan was clutch.
It totally was. I mean, if they hadn't done that, who knows if they ever would have found that tumor? The whole thing might have remained a mystery.
Makes you think, right?
Right.
How many times could we get that definitive diagnosis if we had more access to these advanced imaging techniques?
It's true, we're lucky to have all these amazing tools, but they aren't always practical in a live animal. But postmortem, it can teach us so much. Not just about that one animal, but about these diseases in general.
It's like this cow, even after she was gone, she was still teaching us these incredibly important lessons. It's a good reminder. There's always more to learn, always something new to discover, and sometimes it's the weird cases, the ones that make you scratch your head, those are the ones that really stick with you.
I couldn't agree more. Cases like this one, they really drive that point home.
From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.